Okay, so hello everyone. This is a recording for some of our classes, which we will conduct using the blended learning method. Um, so excuse my voice, I still have a sore throat. Uh, anyway, I hope you can see the screen. So we'll be going through disorders of thought and speech, and this is our outline. So just give it a second. Right. So we'll be discussing disorders of intelligence, disorders of the stream of thought. We'll be discussing obsessions, compulsions, and the disorders of the possession of thought. We'll be discussing disorders of the content of thinking, disorders of the form of thinking, and finally, speech disorders. So in our outline, essentially, we have three categories of psychopathology that we will be discussing. The first one is disorders of intelligence, and then the second one is disorders of thought itself, which includes stream of thought, obsessions, compulsions, and possession of thought, content of thinking, and the form of thinking. And our third group of psychopathology here will be the speech disorders. So let's start with the disorders of intelligence. We'll look at the introduction, we'll look at measurement of intelligence, and then we'll look at intellectual disability, learning disability, IQ categories for disability, dementia, and how it relates to intelligence, and how schizophrenia as a psychotic disorder is related to intelligence, or how it affects intelligence. So the simple definition for intelligence is basically the ability to think and act rationally or logically. So it is a cognitive domain in the sense that it includes different aspects of cognition and different areas of the brain and different neurotransmitters as well. So measuring it, therefore, is quite complex, and it can be quite controversial, especially when we're looking at things like standardization of intelligence tests over different geographical areas in the world because of cultural issues, right? So in practice, though, most tests rely heavily on measuring intelligence by measuring the ability to solve problems and form concepts. And usually solving problems and forming concepts is by the use of words, numbers, symbols, patterns, and nonverbal material. But again, when you really look at this list of things, that are used to measure intelligence, the words, the numbers, symbols, especially patterns, nonverbal material, and nonverbal communication, they vary in terms of different sociocultural, areas of the world, or sociocultural groups of people. So the most common way that people measure intelligence is in terms of the distribution of scores of these tests in a population. So you find that a person who has an intelligence score in the 75th percentile has a score that is such that 75% of the population falls under that category, and that you'll find 25% fall either on the very high or the very low side. So if you were to draw the curve, basically, you would find that it forms, that bell curve where the majority of people then fall in the 75th percentile, and then you've got a few outliers on each side, right and left, as a discrepancy. So that's also kind of what we do when we look at your test scores academically. We look at where have the majority fallen, or then if we break it down further, what question has been answered very well by the group of students. So it gives us feedback then on how to intervene and what to do. So one of the oldest IQ scores, which is a quantifiable measure of intelligence, is to look at the chronological age of the child and the mental age of the child, and then put that into an IQ score, a quantifiable IQ score. So it's quite controversial, really, the IQ score, because it doesn't always, use that format when you look at someone's chronological age and their mental age. So it's not very accurate, in terms of the validity of the information it gives you. And the mean IQ really in a population is by 100. So most people are at 100, give or take a standard deviation of 15 plus or minus on each end. So brain damage itself is associated with low intelligence, but not necessarily when you measure the IQ. We're talking about rational thinking and processing and judgment and abstract thinking, et cetera, more in terms of cognitive domain, really. Associated with intelligence. So brain damage can lead to, or is associated with low intelligence. Brain damage can be secondary to a number of issues. It could be birth trauma in children. It could be infections like meningitis. It could be due to febrile illnesses that have led to febrile seizures. It could be due to traumatic brain injury in adults as well. Repeated epileptiform discharges during epilepsy can actually affect the way a person processes information and their thinking and decision making, and et cetera. But when we look at now in terms of people with low intelligence, in general, we look at two groups. We look at intellectual disability and learning disability. So Fish has written the opposite of this, but intellectual disability is associated with individuals who essentially intelligence is at the lowest end on a normal range. And we're looking more on the quantitative deviation of it. So if you were to look at the IQ, we're looking at IQ scores that are much lower than 100, right? And then learning disabilities are individuals with specific learning disabilities. So not necessarily a whole group of people with intellectual disability, but more along the way of, thinking rationally and applying all those words, concepts, et cetera, in different domains. There are some struggles. So examples are, you've probably heard of this, dyslexia and dyscalculia. So impairment of reading is called dyslexia. There may also be impairment in written expression. There may be impairment with mathematics as well, which is known as dyscalculia. And all of these can be understood in a, excuse me, in a range of severity, okay? So IQ categories, when we talk of disability, we talk of mild intellectual disability with an IQ range of 50 to 69, moderate intellectual disability is an IQ level of 35 to 49, severe intellectual disability is IQ levels of 20 to 34, and then below 20 is what we call profound intellectual disability. But you find in real life, severe and profound intellectual disability are associated with multiple chromosomal abnormalities. So most of these pregnancies actually don't make it to term, or if they do and the baby is born, they don't survive for a very long period. So we find that we don't have enough data on long-term data on people with severe or profound intellectual disability. When we talk of intelligence in terms of dementia, again, we're referencing, the impairment in processes of thinking and processes of retaining information, processing information. Obviously, then we start talking about memory, orientation, and things like that. So there's a loss of intelligence as a result of brain disease. We'll look at dementia as a whole later throughout the semester when we look at neurocognitive disorders, but things like Alzheimer's disease, vascular dementia, dementia associated with HIV, frontotemporal dementia, things like that. There's disturbances in cortical functions. So you've got neurotransmitter imbalances, you've got actual anatomical lesions that affect thinking itself, memory, comprehension, which is understanding, and orientation as well to a certain level. We also have psychotic disorders that can impair intelligence. So what we call primary or functional psychiatric illnesses or mental disorders. So in schizophrenia, we are currently seeing that there is cognitive impairment and it has a significant impact on the person's functioning, but also it affects the patient's prognosis. We found that early onset schizophrenia presents more with cognitive impairment than traditional psychotic symptoms like hallucinations and delusions and abnormal behaviors. We've also found that cognitive impairment is associated with more focal neurological signs and, very poor prognosis of schizophrenia as a whole as an illness. So you can have symptoms of, low intelligence, and it can be misdiagnosed as a purely intellectual issue, or as an early onset dementia. Sometimes, if we're looking at patients in 40s, 50s, early 60s. But if you're looking at early onset schizophrenia, which is between the ages of 10 to 18, we find that most of these patients actually have cognitive impairment as the forefront of the symptoms that we're seeing in terms of clinical features. Okay, so the next recording is going to be on disorders of thought. Yeah.